Every Friday, Whole Foods does $1 oysters for Prime members, and I got some oysters, and I'm going to show you every single oyster I got, including the ones that actually tasted really good and fresh, and some of the ones that I had to spit back out after tasting them. Now for me, Whole Foods is not a quick drive. I'm about an hour and a half from my nearest Whole Foods, but $1 oysters, for some reason, makes me feel like it's worth it. So I got to the one right here in Springfield, Virginia, and made my way back to the seafood counter. Now, I love the fact that they have a lot of different seafood here, including shucked oysters from right there in Southern Maryland, but I was here for these oysters in the shell, and all of these were actually $1 a piece. Now, after talking to the fishmonger, I found out there were 6 different varieties, so I decided to get some of all 6, and I was still able to get that $1 oyster deal because I did order more than 12 of them, and that's where the deal kicks in. So now that I had my oysters, I went ahead and headed to checkout, and make sure you enter your Prime number because that will make it so you actually get that discount. Now for the first taste test, these are skinny dipper oysters, and we're not starting off strong. Right away I noticed that this thing sounded hollow, which is a bad sign for an oyster, and there was a cut or like a break in the shell there, and that means it probably doesn't have any liquid inside of it, and without liquid or the water inside of it, the oyster is not going to live. And sure enough, I opened this thing up and it was completely dried out. Like, that's gross. That shouldn't happen. I went ahead and picked up another skinny dipper oyster out of the bag, and this one felt a little bit better, but honestly, I was a little bit leery of eating any of these skinny dipper oysters just because of that first one, and I'm not sure how fresh they are. Now I shucked this one, and I could tell, like, while it wasn't, fresh from the water, it did look better just because you could tell that there was some oyster liquor in there and the oyster was still alive. And despite my better judgment, I did give this one a taste, and I was right. It didn't taste bad, like rotten, but it didn't taste fresh either. So far, we're off to a rocky start, Whole Foods. Let's hope this next one is going to help us out. So the next oyster I got was actually a Wellfleet Oyster. Now, I've had Wellfleet oysters from a lot of different places, including the Real Oyster Cult and some local oyster bars around my house too. And this one actually looked pretty fresh and pretty good. Now, a little tip here. I didn't do it this time, but if you want to know when your oyster is harvested, it is U.S. law that they have to keep the harvest tag with those oysters. So what I should have done, especially with those skinny dippers, I should have asked when they were harvested, and they would have to show that seafood harvester tag. Now, in my personal opinion, I don't mind oysters that are like 3 days old to like 5 days old, but if you're starting to get to like 7 days old and they've been out of the water for 7 days, maybe 10 days, that's a little bit too long for me, and it's probably not an oyster I'm going to buy. Looking at that oyster, that one looks super fresh, and I'm actually excited to eat this one, and it did not disappoint. Wellfleet oysters have a nice brine. They got a little bit of sweetness and umami. This was actually a really good oyster from Whole Foods, and I would recommend checking out the Wellfleet oysters when you go there if they have them at your store. The next oyster I have, this is going to be another Chesapeake Bay Oyster, and this was actually an Atlantic Battle Creek Oyster. Now, I've had Atlantic Battle Creek oysters before, and they tend to be a little bit salty. They have a good amount of sweetness, and when they're fresh, I think they're actually a really good oyster. Now, this one had another good sign. You could see there was water inside this one, so it means it was somewhat fresh. I went ahead and opened this one up, and it was pretty easy to get shucked despite that little bit of shell flaking. I was able to cut the adductor muscle away pretty easily too. Sometimes that's a sign of it being not as fresh, but looking at the meat, this one actually looked pretty good. It was a little bit stringy and almost looked a little bit like, not plump. But I don't know if that's from the freshness or just because of the oyster itself. Now, once I taste this oyster, I'm not quite sure how to explain it, except that it just tastes flat. I could taste a lot of the salt, but I couldn't taste any of the sweetness, and it just tasted a little bit flat. It tasted like it had been sitting there for a little bit too. Again, I wish I would have looked at the harvest tags just so I would have known when these are actually harvested instead of guessing, and I probably wouldn't have bought some of these ones. The fourth oyster I'm trying is from the Rappahannock River Oyster Company. Now, I've had these fresh where they actually deliver them right to my house within a few days of harvesting, and I actually like these as a good representation of just a good, solid, sweet with a little bit of brine Chesapeake Bay Oyster. I find them pretty easy to shuck, and this one was pretty easy. It was my fault there. I kind of had a dull knife that was making it so it was flaking, but after I was able to get the knife right into that hinge, they popped open pretty quickly, and open it up, I could tell there was a good amount of oyster liquor. The oyster looked pretty plump, and I was actually pretty excited to eat this one because I thought it was going to be fairly good. And looking at the oyster on the inside, it was a nice, plump, juicy looking oyster, and I think this one's going to taste like it's supposed to, like a good, sweet, mild brine oyster. And sure enough, I was right. This is a perfect example of a Chesapeake Bay oyster, and also the fact that it was nice and fresh. I could taste the sweetness, a little bit of the brine. It didn't feel like it's been sitting there for a while. This Rappahannock River Oyster Company oyster was definitely worth the $1, and I'd even pay more for it. The fifth oyster that I'm trying from Whole Foods is going to be a Stish Bay Oyster. Now, these are a personal favorite, and I actually got them from Whole Foods before, and I was pleasantly surprised with how fresh they were. And opening this one up, I can tell that it's nice and tightly closed. It looks like it has some oyster liquor in there, and I'm actually pretty hopeful this is going to be another fresh one. Now, these are normally $1.99, so you're getting them for 50% off, and if they're fresh, I really think it is the best oyster you can buy at Whole Foods for $1 by far. So I went ahead and opened it up. The meat fills up most of the shell. It looks nice and plump. At this point, I think this is going to be probably the best tasting oyster that I've had out of all the ones so far for this $1 oyster haul that I'm doing right now. So I went ahead, got it ready to slurp, and this thing did not disappoint. The Stish oysters have a nice bit of brine on there, but they also have a lot of sweetness and umami. This is a really solid oyster, and I highly recommend checking those ones out. Now, the sixth and final oyster is one I'm going to tell you right now. Avoid it. Do not eat any of these oysters from Whole Foods. I'm sure there are other people that are selling these oysters that sell better Blue Point oysters, but right now, every single Whole Foods Blue Point oyster that I have gotten, I have thought was trash. This first one that I shucked, I didn't think looked bad at all. I opened it up and it looked plump, and actually it looked like it was going to be a really good oyster. There was a pea crab in it, which normally doesn't bother me at all, so I went ahead and left in there because I was okay with eating the pea crab with the oyster. Now, as soon as I tasted this one, though, it just tasted off. I gave it a few chews. I could tell that the pea crab was in there. I thought maybe the pea crab is what made it taste bad. So I tried another oyster, and sure enough, it wasn't the pea crab. It was the oyster itself. It tasted like straight up fish, and I'm never getting another Blue Point oyster from Whole Foods again. So that's my experience with $1 oysters. What I would recommend is ask for that seafood tag every time you go so you know you're getting fresh stuff, and 100% stay away from Blue Point oysters from Whole Foods.